just spectacular. This is like once in a lifetime kind of feeling. Look at this. Hey everyone, I'm Tim, and I've just finished a 9-month odyssey around Latin America. Now I'm reopening my diaries, and this time I'm bringing you along with me. Week by week, country by country, all the colors, all the craziness, all the food, all the music, and all the splendor. 9 months when each morning was a new adventure. The road was my companion, and Latin America cast its spell on me. This is my Latin America Diaries. Welcome back to Latin America Diaries. I left Sao Paulo very early one morning on an Azul Airlines flight towards Foz do Iguaçu, the Brazilian gateway city to Iguazu Falls. And I have to say that Iguazu Falls was one of the most spectacular things that I saw during my entire trip in Latin America. Even thinking about it today gives me chills. The flight in was great. We descended over the Iguazu River with the falls visible in the distance, an unforgettable approach. Now, Foz do Iguaçu, far from being some isolated outpost at the waterfalls in the jungle, it's actually a reasonably sized city of 260,000 people, and it's home to an international airport as well. This region is known as the Triple Frontier, where Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay meet. Directly to the south of Foz do Iguaçu is Argentina, with its own service town called Puerto Iguaçu, which also has a slightly smaller airport. To the west, the Iguazu River meets the Paraná River, marking the border point between the three countries. Just beyond that, in Paraguay, lies Ciudad del Este, a major commercial hub. It's actually quite a modern city and has grown rapidly over the past few decades, and it also has its own airport. However, while Paraguay is very close geographically, the falls themselves are split between Brazil and Argentina, not Paraguay. After arriving at Foz do Iguaçu Airport, I headed directly to my hostel, which was Hostel Poesia, which was an interesting construction. It felt more like a residential house than a typical hostel, but it was actually really lovely. After checking in, I engaged the services of a local driver who I'd been connected with through the hostel to drive me out to the Brazilian side of the Iguazu Falls. They are accessible via local bus, however, it was getting later in the afternoon and I felt that I was running out of time, so I decided to do that just to hurry things up a little bit. When you arrive at the falls, you first stop at the main entrance and visit a reception area to buy your tickets. From there, you can either walk further into the park or take the courtesy shuttle bus that runs through the national park. Since I was short on time, I jumped straight onto one of the buses. The drive itself is quite an experience. You wind your way through subtropical jungle, and occasionally you might catch a glimpse of a monkey in a tree along the way. And then eventually you stop outside the visitor center and make your way out onto the balcony, and that's where it happens. You catch your very first glimpse of the falls. And it is spectacular. Rather than being just one waterfall, Iguaçu is a vast system of cascades tumbling over a huge escarpment. From the Brazilian side, you're mostly viewing the falls head-on, which really gives you a sense of their scale and raw power. It's less about being on top of the falls and more about witnessing the full panorama of them stretching across the horizon. A few flights of steps down and I was on my way to the boardwalk that takes you out towards Garganta del Diablo, the Devil's Throat. This is the part where the water of the falls is at its most turbulent. The Devil's Throat itself is primarily accessed from the Argentine side, but on the Brazilian side you get one of the most dramatic frontal views of it. There's a series of boardwalks that extend out towards the base of the falls, and as you get closer the sound intensifies. The mist thickens and the atmosphere becomes almost surreal. At one point you walk out onto a platform where you're surrounded by spray, with waterfalls crashing down all around you. Earlier along the path there are some sections of the boardwalk that sit slightly above the river level, right on the threshold of the falls, allowing you to peer down into the Iguazu River far below, with the waterfalls thundering behind and beside you. From these vantage points, you can look across the gorge and see the immense semicircle of cascades, including the powerful funnel of the Devil's Throat in the distance. The iconic image most people picture when they think of Iguazu Falls. One thing that genuinely surprised me was the amount of vegetation clinging to the cliff faces. Water trickled down through dense greenery between the cascades, giving the whole scene this lush, almost prehistoric feel. It didn't feel barren or rocky, it felt alive. Eventually, as the afternoon drew to a close, I made my way back up towards the visitor center and boarded one of the buses. It was time to leave the park. There are options to stay in the park and watch sunset over the falls, but that came as an extra ticket and I hadn't booked that. No longer in a rush, I made my way back to the park entrance and caught the commuter bus from the terminal, returned to my hostel, drenched in mist, slightly exhausted, but completely blown away by what I had just seen. If you're enjoying this content, please make sure that you like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload new stories and vlogs from this series. And if you really like what you're seeing, I'd really appreciate it if you could share my content on social media and tell your friends and family about it. It really means a lot to me and it really helps me grow this YouTube channel. The next morning I headed over to Puerto Iguaçu, and from there another bus from Puerto Iguaçu to the entrance of the national park on the Argentinian side of the falls. What's fascinating about this region is just how interconnected it is. Puerto Iguaçu, Foz do Iguaçu and Ciudad del Este all sit incredibly close to one another at the triple frontier. Even though you're technically crossing international borders, local buses regularly crisscross between the countries because it's very common for people to live in one country and work in another. As a result, border procedures in this area are quite streamlined. However, this is where I learned an important lesson, and that is that because the border processes are streamlined, buses traveling from Foz do Iguaçu over to Puerto Iguaçu in Argentina don't need to stop at the Brazilian border post because Brazilian customs regulations don't require Brazilian citizens to be stamped out here. If you are a tourist and you're not a Brazilian and you're taking this bus, you need to actually tell the bus driver and request him to stop at the border post to be stamped out of Brazil. Otherwise, you'll just be driven over and then welcomed into Argentina without an exit stamp from Brazil. That's not so much of a problem in itself, but if you're planning to travel back into Brazil later that day, as I was, then the bus will stop at the Brazilian border on entry and you will be asked to show your exit stamp from Brazil. There are heavy penalties for people who don't have that exit stamp because it appears that you left Brazil illegally. Just a word of warning, if you are traveling in this part of the world, make sure that you alert the bus driver and make it known that you are not a Brazilian citizen and will need to be stamped out of Brazil on your way over into Argentina. If you do this, then the bus will drop you at the Brazilian border post as you are leaving, and the bus will then probably continue without you to Argentina. So make sure that you get all of your luggage, anything that you're carrying, you get off the bus with that. And there's normally a bus every 30 minutes to 1 hour. And so once you're done with the Brazilian border formalities, you can just stand there and wait for the next bus to come through and take you through to Argentina. Iguazu Falls was catapulted to modern cinematic fame by the 1986 film The Mission. It featured an evocative and emotive score by Ennio Morricone. The Mission tells the story of Jesuit missionaries traveling to this part of South America. In one particularly powerful scene, an unwelcome missionary is bound to a cross and sent over the falls, and the landscape becomes more than just a setting. It feels symbolic. The falls represent the overwhelming power of nature, the enormity of fate, and the insignificance of one man against the forces of the universe. Now, while the most iconic panoramic view of the falls is from the Brazilian side, it's the Argentinian side that you get right up close and personal with the Iguazu Falls. This experience on the Argentinian side starts quite differently. Instead of immediately seeing the falls, you initially walk through a dense subtropical jungle along a network of trails and raised walkways, with the distant sound of rushing water growing louder and louder as you go. The Argentinian side of the falls is also much more extensive than the Brazilian side, and it's really here that you understand why they're called the falls rather than just a single waterfall. The Iguazu Falls complex is made up of around 275 individual cascades spread across nearly 3 kilometers of escarpment. So one thing that I can say about the Argentina side of this so far is that you would remember that yesterday when I went to the Brazil side, you can see how the falls are not just like one fall, but actually lots of places where the water is like tumbling over the edge of the cliff. And so it's not sort of just like off one river, but I mean the river's quite wide and there's all these different bits where it falls over. And on the Argentina side, that's where all that is going on. So as you're walking along on the Argentina side, you actually are walking amid all of those smaller streams which are heading towards the falls. From certain viewpoints, you can actually see just how vast the system is. In some places, the waterfall is directly in front of you and is only a small part of a much larger curtain of water stretching far into the distance. It really gives you a sense of scale that the photos simply don't capture. Because of its size, the Argentinian side is divided into different circuits and routes. Some parts are relatively easy and accessible, while others are longer and more strenuous. There are walkways that bring you incredibly close to the falls, and then there is the route out to Garganta del Diablo, the Devil's Throat, which is the most dramatic viewpoint of all. You can walk there, but it is several kilometers through the park. If you're not up for the full walk, there is a small ecological train that takes you most of the way, leaving only about a 1 to 2 kilometer walk to the final viewing platform. That final walk is unforgettable. It feels like you're walking out to the edge of the world. The path stretches out over the water on a long series of metal walkways, surrounded by an enormous, slow-moving river. You know that all of this water is eventually destined for the falls, even though the drop itself is still hidden from view. What's striking is just how calm it feels at first. At this point, the water and the river is wide, flat, and almost eerily placid, like a shimmering mirror stretching to the horizon. It feels almost desert-like in its vastness, quiet and still before the sudden violence of the drop. You can hear a roar long before you see it, a distant growing thunder. And then, as you approach the end of the walkway, that calm surface seems to break like a crack in a glass floor, and suddenly it gives way to the abyss of the falls themselves. Approaching the Devil's Throat feels almost cinematic. You step onto the final platform and suddenly you're right there, face to face with the most spectacular section of the falls.
I say this about everywhere that I go, but honestly this, I think, is one of the most spectacular, it's not just spectacular, this is like once in a lifetime kind of feeling. Look at this. It's like the full force, the full fury of nature on display right before our eyes.
This is the highest and most dramatic vantage point, where you're looking directly into the vast chasm as an immense volume of water crashes down below. On average, around 1.5 million liters of water per second plunge over the falls, although this can increase dramatically after heavy rainfall. Standing out there surrounded by mist and the deafening roar, the sheer scale of it is overwhelming. The quantity of water, the force, the sound, it's almost sensory overload. I found myself feeling emotional without even realizing it, without preparing for it. It was just the enormity of nature in front of me. Raw, powerful, and beautiful. It's not an exaggeration to say that I don't know if I've seen anything quite like it before. I spent 2 days at Iguazu Falls and taking in both the Brazilian and the Argentinian side, and that really is worth it. If you have the time, I would highly recommend that. The Brazilian side really gives you that panoramic, iconic postcard image, whereas the Argentinian side is immersive and impactful. That afternoon I headed back to Foz do Iguaçu, where I got a haircut and then went to a restaurant for an early dinner. There I got chatting with an Indian man who had been traveling through South America 40 years ago and had decided to settle in Foz do Iguaçu. He was fluent in Portuguese, Hindi, and had broken English, and it was just a reminder of how multicultural this region is. The next morning it was time to keep moving and onwards to my next country, Paraguay. Paraguay did not originally feature in my plans in traveling around Latin America, but it was right there, so it seemed like a missed opportunity if I didn't go. Sure, I could have continued further south from Puerto Iguaçu in Argentina and continued my journey southwards, but it would have been only adding another couple of days to travel across to Paraguay and see something there, so I thought, why not? And besides, Paraguay also is home to some special ruins that are very connected to the history of the Jesuit missionaries in the region and which directly link back to Iguazu Falls. So there I was, caught local bus across to Ciudad del Este, which is Paraguay's second largest city, but not necessarily a representative introduction to the country. It was largely developed as a commercial hub to encourage trade between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, and to attract Brazilian and Argentinian day trippers for duty-free shopping. As a result, it has grown rapidly and somewhat chaotically, with function clearly taking priority over aesthetics. It's a vast market city built around commerce, electronics, and retail. I was even told that Ciudad del Este was once called the armpit of the world by a Chilean journalist back in the 1990s, and that apparently sparked off a diplomatic row between the two countries. Despite its rough commercial feel, the wider Triple Frontier region has a surprisingly diverse population, including large Lebanese and Palestinian communities. That cultural mix means you can find some excellent Middle Eastern food in the area, so naturally I stopped for a shawarma before continuing the journey. From there, I boarded a bus heading south along the Paraná River towards Encarnación. Officially Paraguay's third largest city after Asunción and Ciudad del Este, it arguably feels more like the country's true second city in cultural terms. While Ciudad del Este is driven by trade and border commerce, Encarnación has grown more organically with a calmer atmosphere and a stronger sense of local identity. Encarnación turned out to be a surprisingly lovely city, and although Paraguay is landlocked, it almost has a coastal feel here because the Paraná River is so wide that it looks more like a sea than a river. There's even a beach along the waterfront, and locals were flocking to it. It was towards the end of summer, still very hot, and the whole place had a relaxed, beachy atmosphere. I found a cafe where I could sit and order a pistachio cheesecake. Pistachio was still very much having its Dubai chocolate viral moment at the time, and celebrate the Paraguay edition of my 40th birthday. Later, I made my way towards the town's main bus station to catch a bus towards the town of Trinidad. Trinidad itself is a very small town just north of Encarnación, and I had to board a bus that was continuing further along its route and ask the driver to drop me off at the stop there. From the roadside, I walked up towards the ruins of Trinidad, the remains of a former Jesuit mission that once stood in this region. So I'm going to try and boil down into a very short video exactly what this place is. Now, in the 1600s, when the Spanish Empire was at its conquesting peak here in South America, around the same time, another group entered South America, and it wasn't just the Portuguese, it was actually a group called the Jesuits. The Jesuits are a group of Catholics who truly believe in the power of God to do good and change the world. And their belief was that by disavowing violence and providing social services, schools and hospitals and so on to the Guarani, the people, the indigenous people of this region, they would be doing God's work. So it's kind of the Mother Teresa school of colonialism, if you like. It's been described as benign colonialism, which stands in contrast to the malignant colonialism of the Spanish Empire at the time, and also an experiment in socialist theocracy because it was based in religion, but it oversaw the provision of social services to the needy. The Jesuits who arrived in this part of South America, in the south and east of Paraguay, as well as over the border in Argentina and Brazil,
They believed in the power of providing these social services to bring people into Christianity and Catholicism. And that's exactly what they did to the indigenous Guarani people in this region. And if you have seen the movie The Mission, the conflict between the two types of colonialism, if you like, between that of the Jesuits and that of the Spanish Empire is highlighted in that movie, sort of the disavowing of violence versus the belief in violence to further their goals. At their peak, the Jesuit missions here in south and eastern Paraguay, in northern Argentina and the south of Brazil, at their peak they had a combined population of over 100,000 people, and they were a mix of European and Guarani people. It all ended about 150 years later when the Jesuits were expelled from South America, often violently, not by the Guarani people themselves, but in fact by the Spanish crown, no less, who saw the Jesuits' existence here in this part of South America as a direct threat to their dominance in the region. Now, just to be clear, I'm not endorsing what the Jesuits did. It was still colonialism. Yes, they provided schools and hospitals. They also brought abuse and diseases to the Guarani people. However, it is important to understand that context when you're looking at this site. These are among the least visited World Heritage Sites in the world. The site felt deeply eerie, and walking through them in near silence added to that atmosphere. But what made it especially haunting was the context. Just 2 days earlier, I had been standing at the Iguazu Falls and thinking about the history of the region, the local native Guarani people, the arrival of the Jesuit missionaries, and the expanding reach of the Spanish Empire. To then walk through these ruins and knowing how much history had unfolded there, not only in terms of architecture, but in the lives and cultures and upheavals and devastation experienced by the people connected to this place, that was quite confronting. The missions represented imposition and cultural disruption. However, in some way, they also functioned as places of refuge. It's a complicated and layered history, and being there in person made that complexity feel very real. It was above all a haunting experience. After exploring the site, I walked back down to the main highway where I was told that I would be able to flag down any passing bus towards Encarnación and get a lift back into the city. However, I waited and I waited and I waited. And I was starting to think that maybe I'd need to, take up residence in Trinidad. But eventually, after a couple of hours, a bus did actually pass and stopped and picked me up and took me back to Encarnación, where I was staying at the Posada Turística Basiliza, a family-run homestay where I was staying. It was simple, warm, and incredibly welcoming. A perfect place to return to after such a long and reflective day. And that really was my time in Paraguay. I was only there for a total of 3 days, but it was enough to, say that I've seen something in Paraguay, but it's not enough that I could do a complete wrap-up or talk about the country as a whole, because I really only did see a sample of it. I bought my charm for Paraguay, which was a cross in a bronze finish, similar to the color of the stone at the Jesuit ruins. The next morning it was time to move on once again. I won't be doing a wrap-up of my time in Paraguay because I don't think that 3 days is really enough to do it justice. However, I will be doing a wrap of my time in Brazil. Okay, time for the rapid fire round. So, Brazil, best city? I had a great time in Sao Paulo. Salvador da Bahia was awesome. And Rio de Janeiro is just Rio de Janeiro. There's nothing else to say about that. Best region in Brazil? Without hesitation, it's the Northeast. From Belém to Lençóis Maranhenses, Jericoacoara, João Pessoa, Recife, Olinda, and down to Salvador. That entire run across the Northeast of Brazil was just dreamlike. It was my favorite part. One of my favorite parts of the entire trip, actually. Best food? For me, I think I would probably say I really loved moqueca in Salvador. I loved the Brazilian barbecue that I had with Ney in Belém after getting off the boat for all those days. But then there were other things too, like I really liked coxinha.
I loved those pastries with the palm hearts in them that I tasted in Sao Paulo with Milene. And I really got a taste for beiju, the tapioca pancake for breakfast. Best experience in Brazil? Look, it has to be Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, hands down. However, I would also mention the boat that I took down the Amazon for 5 days. That was an experience of a lifetime. And I would also say attending the Festival of Iemanjá in Salvador. I mean, that was just mesmerizing. All in all, Brazil was just extraordinary. It was one of my top countries that I have ever visited, and I will definitely be back. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and make sure that you tune in again next time on Latin America Diaries, when we will be heading to a brand new country.